The whispers of Silver Peak had long forgotten the sound of Hannah Morgan's laughter. 8 years she'd weathered alone on the edge of the Colorado frontier, her solitude a shield against memories that cut deeper than the winter winds. But fate had other plans on this stormy April night in 1875, when a thunderous knock shattered the quiet sanctuary she'd built for herself. Hannah reached for the shotgun propped beside the door, her calloused fingers wrapping around the familiar wooden stock. The plains of Colorado had taught her caution, especially when living 10 miles from the nearest neighbor. Silver Peak might be growing since the new silver mine opened 2 years back. But out here, a woman alone was still her own first and last line of defense. The pounding came again, more desperate this time, accompanied by a man's deep voice that somehow cut through the howl of the storm. "Please, madam, anyone there? We need shelter." When Hannah cracked open the door, shotgun raised, the sight before her nearly made her step back. Illuminated by a flash of lightning stood the largest man she'd ever seen, 6.5 feet tall at least, broad-shouldered, with rain-soaked clothes, clinging to a frame that seemed carved from the mountains themselves. But what caught her attention wasn't his imposing presence. It was the tiny bundle clutched protectively against his chest, a small whimpering sound emerging from beneath the drenched blanket. "Please," the stranger said again, his voice breaking as he shifted the bundle. The movement revealed a baby's face, red and scrunched with discomfort. "Just one night. My little girl's burning up with fever. We've been caught in this storm for hours." His eyes, a startling clear blue, held no threat, only desperation and exhaustion. Hannah's finger eased off the trigger. "Who are you?" "Hank Jameson, ma'am, from up Montana way." He adjusted his stance, shielding the infant from the driving rain. "I wouldn't ask, but there's nowhere else for miles. The town's too far in this weather, and she's—" his voice caught. "She needs to be warm and dry." The baby's weak cry made Hannah's decision for her. 8 years of solitude had hardened her resolve, but not her heart. She stepped back, lowering the shotgun. "Come in then, but just for tonight." As Hank ducked through the doorway, Hannah Morgan couldn't know that this one night would unravel the careful isolation she'd built around herself since the day she buried her husband and son beneath the unforgiving Colorado soil. Hannah's cabin was modest but meticulously maintained, a testament to her self-reliance. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting warm light across the polished wooden floors she'd installed herself. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting area combined, with a small bedroom partitioned off in the back. Every inch spoke of careful attention, from the tightly chinked logs to the neat row of preserved fruits lining a shelf. "Set her down here," Hannah instructed, clearing space on a rocking chair near the fire and laying out a clean blanket. "I'll fetch some fresh water." Hank moved with surprising gentleness for such a large man, cradling the infant as if she were made of glass. As he unwrapped the damp blanket, Hannah caught her first clear glimpse of the child, no more than 6 months old, with wisps of dark hair plastered to a feverish forehead. "What's her name?" Hannah asked, returning with a basin of water and clean rags. "Lily," Hank answered softly, his rough hands looking enormous as they carefully held the tiny form. "After her mother." Hannah nodded, not asking the obvious question about where the mother was. She'd heard enough stories of women lost in childbirth to recognize the grief etched into the lines of this man's weathered face. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, soaking a cloth and gently bathing the baby's flushed skin. "When did the fever start?" she asked, keeping her voice professional, detached. "Yesterday morning. We were passing through these parts, heading south. Thought we could make it to Silver Peak before the storm." He ran a hand through his sodden dark hair, spattering droplets on the floor. "I'm sorry about the mess, ma'am." "Hannah," she corrected automatically. "Hannah Morgan. And don't worry about the floor. It's seen worse." Working methodically, Hannah checked the baby for signs of serious illness, relieved to find only the fever and some congestion. "She needs willow bark tea, watered down for an infant. I have some dried herbs that should help." She glanced up at Hank, noting his dripping clothes. "You should change too. I can't have two patients on my hands. There are some clothes in that trunk that might fit you. My husband's." If Hank noticed the slight catch in her voice at the mention of her husband, he didn't comment. He simply nodded his thanks. "I won't impose on your kindness any longer than necessary, Miss Morgan." "Mrs.," she corrected, though she hadn't used the title in years. "And I meant what I said, just for tonight. First light, you and Lily should be on your way." An hour later, Hank sat beside the fire in clothes that strained at his broad shoulders, but were at least dry. Lily, swaddled in fresh linens, had taken a few spoonfuls of the willow bark concoction, and now slept more peacefully in a makeshift cradle Hannah had fashioned from a drawer. "You're good with children," Hank observed quietly, watching as Hannah checked Lily's temperature with the back of her hand. Something flickered across Hannah's face. Pain, perhaps, or memory, before she composed herself. "I had some experience once." The silence that followed was filled only by the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain on the cabin roof. Hannah busied herself with preparing a simple meal, cornbread and a rabbit stew that had been simmering all day. "I hope you don't mind sharing," she said, setting a bowl before her unexpected guest. "I don't usually cook for company." Hank accepted the food gratefully. "I can't remember the last proper meal I had." "Thank you." As they ate, Hannah studied her visitor more carefully. Despite his intimidating size, there was nothing threatening in his manner. His face, now visible without the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, was handsome in a rugged way, tanned from outdoor life, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. A scar ran along his right temple, disappearing into his hairline, but it was his eyes that caught her attention again, clear blue, honest, and carrying a sadness that matched her own. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Jameson?" Hannah asked, breaking the silence. "Just Hank," he replied, setting down his spoon. "I'm looking for work. Heard the silver mine in Silver Peak was hiring. I was a foreman up in Montana before." He glanced toward the sleeping infant. "Before things changed." Hannah nodded, understanding the unspoken. Life had a way of upending the most solid of plans. Silver Peak's grown since they struck that vein 2 years back. You shouldn't have trouble finding work if you know mining. "I do. Started when I was 16. He hesitated, then added, "May I ask how long you've been out here alone, Mrs. Morgan?" Hannah stiffened slightly. 8 years, and I've managed just fine." "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise," Hank said quickly. "It's just impressive. Most folks I know couldn't handle this kind of isolation." "Most folks haven't had reason to seek it out," Hannah replied more sharply than she intended. An awkward silence fell between them. Hannah stood to clear the dishes, uncomfortable with how easily this stranger had pushed past her carefully constructed walls with a simple observation. For 8 years, she'd spoken more to her livestock than to other humans, limiting her interactions to brief transactions in town every few months. Now, in the space of an evening, she'd allowed not only a stranger, but an infant into her home. As if sensing her discomfort, Hank changed the subject. "That's fine craftsmanship," he said, nodding toward a small wooden horse displayed on the mantel. "Your husband's work?" Hannah's hand paused mid-reach for his empty bowl. "Mine, actually." Surprise registered on Hank's face. "You're a carpenter." "I'm a woman who learned to use tools," she corrected. "Out here, you either learn or you perish." The storm intensified as the evening wore on, wind howling around the cabin's corners and rattling the shutters Hannah had installed years ago. Lily woke crying once, but settled quickly after another dose of the willow bark tea and the gentle rocking of Hannah's arms. The easy way the baby relaxed against her chest stirred long-buried memories. The weight of another child, the trust of small fingers curled around her own. When Lily was settled again, Hannah turned to find Hank watching her with an unreadable expression. "You should get some sleep," she told him, avoiding his gaze. "You can take the bed. I'll stay out here with Lily." "I couldn't put you out of your bed, Mrs. Morgan. It's no trouble. I often sleep by the fire in winter anyway." It wasn't entirely true, but Hannah felt an inexplicable need to maintain some distance from this man who observed too much. Hank looked like he might argue, but seemed to think better of it. "If you're sure." "I am." Hannah settled into the rocking chair, pulling a quilt around her shoulders. "First light, Mr. Jameson. Then you and Lily continue on." Hank nodded slowly. "First light," he agreed, though something in his tone suggested he had more to say. Instead, he retreated to the small bedroom, ducking his head to clear the doorframe. Left alone with the sleeping infant, Hannah allowed herself a moment of weakness, gently tracing a finger along Lily's soft cheek. 8 years since she'd touched a child. 8 years since she'd buried her son, just 3 years old, alongside her husband after the influenza swept through their homestead like wildfire, leaving her the sole survivor. "Just one night," Hannah whispered to herself, as much a warning as a promise. One night of broken solitude wouldn't undo 8 years of careful isolation. Come morning, the cowboy and his motherless daughter would ride out of her life, and she would return to the safety of her solitude. But as the storm raged outside and the child slept peacefully within arm's reach, Hannah Morgan felt something shift inside her, like the first crack in a dam that had held too long against rising waters. Morning came with the storm's retreat, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming under a pale spring sun. Hannah woke with a start, momentarily confused by the weight in her arms until she remembered the events of the previous night. Lily was still asleep, her fever noticeably reduced, cheeks no longer flushed with unhealthy color. The sound of chopping wood drew Hannah's attention. Through the window, she saw Hank's broad back as he split logs with her axe, each swing powerful and precise. He'd already amassed a respectable pile beside the chopping block. Hannah felt a strange mixture of irritation and gratitude at the sight. She hadn't asked for his help, yet there was something considerate in the gesture. She gently placed Lily in her makeshift cradle and stepped outside. "You didn't need to do that," she said, pulling her shawl tighter against the morning chill. Hank turned, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. Seemed only fair for the hospitality. He set another log on the block. How's Lily? Better. The fever's broken. Hannah hesitated. You both can stay for breakfast before you head into town. Hank nodded his thanks, bringing down the axe in another clean split. Hannah watched him work for a moment longer than necessary before returning inside to stoke the fire and prepare a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of her honey. When Hank finally came in, arms loaded with wood, Lily was awake and fussing softly. Hannah had changed her and was attempting to feed her some watered-down goat's milk. She's never taken well to anything but her mother's milk, Hank explained, setting down the wood and crossing to take his daughter. We've been making do with goat's milk, but it's been a struggle. She needs a wet nurse, Hannah observed practically. I know. Hank's expression clouded. In Silver Peak, perhaps I can find someone willing. Hannah bit back a comment about the likelihood of finding such accommodations in a mining town. Instead, she focused on serving breakfast, setting a steaming bowl before Hank when he had settled Lily. They ate in companionable silence. The awkwardness of the previous night somehow diminished in the clear light of morning. Outside, Hannah's chickens clucked and her goat bleated, reminding her of chores awaiting attention. I should tend to my animals, she said, rising. I can help, Hank offered. When Hannah looked skeptical, he added, I grew up on a ranch. I know my way around livestock. Against her better judgment, Hannah found herself accepting his assistance. Together they fed the chickens, milked the goat, and checked on Hannah's 2 horses in the small corral behind the cabin. Lily accompanied them, securely bundled and resting in the crook of Hank's arm. Working alongside someone after so many years alone felt strange to Hannah, both intrusive and oddly comforting. Hank moved with the quiet competence of a man accustomed to physical labor, requiring little direction and offering assistance without overstepping. Your place is well maintained, he commented as they finished the morning chores. Better than most homesteads I've seen with 2 people working them. Hannah felt an unexpected flush of pride at his words. I've had time to get it right. Hank's gaze traveled over the neat garden beds freshly turned for spring planting, the solid-looking barn, and the cabin with its even rows of chinked logs. Still, it's impressive. You must work from sunup to sundown. Work keeps the mind occupied, Hannah replied, then immediately regretted the admission. It revealed too much, that she needed occupation, distraction from thoughts better left undisturbed. If Hank noticed the implication, he didn't press. Instead, he shifted Lily to his other arm and said, I should be getting her to town. Find that wet nurse and see about work. Hannah nodded, relief and something like disappointment mingling uncomfortably in her chest. Of course, your horse is rested. As Hank prepared to leave, gathering the few belongings he'd brought in from his saddlebags, Hannah found herself lingering nearby, watching as he carefully wrapped Lily in fresh blankets. The baby seemed vastly improved from the previous night, her eyes bright as she gurgled up at her father. Thank you, Mrs. Morgan, Hank said formally as he stood ready to depart. Your kindness won't be forgotten. It was nothing, Hannah replied, the standard response falling easily from her lips. Anyone would have done the same. Hank's gaze held hers. No, they wouldn't. Not everyone would open their door to strangers in a storm. Hannah looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude in his eyes. Safe travels to Silver Peak, Mr. Jameson. She stood in the doorway, watching as Hank mounted his horse, Lily secured against his chest in a sling he'd fashioned from one of Hannah's donated cloths. He tipped his hat in farewell, and Hannah raised a hand in response, expecting the familiar sense of relief that always came when visitors, rare as they were, departed. Instead, she felt oddly hollow as she watched horse and riders disappear down the trail toward town. With a shake of her head, Hannah turned back to her empty cabin and the comforting routine of her solitary life. By midday, she told herself, she'd have forgotten all about the cowboy and his motherless child. But as Hannah moved through her day, she found her thoughts returning to them with frustrating regularity. Had they found suitable lodging in Silver Peak? Had Hank secured employment at the mine? Most persistently, had he found someone to properly care for Lily? This is ridiculous, Hannah muttered to herself as evening approached, and she realized she'd been unconsciously listening for hoofbeats that wouldn't come. One night of disrupted solitude shouldn't have affected her so. Yet as she prepared her usual solitary supper, Hannah found herself glancing repeatedly at the rocking chair where she'd held Lily and at the place at her table where Hank had sat. The silence, once comforting, now seemed to press in around her with unwelcome weight. She ate without tasting her food, then cleaned up mechanically before settling with her mending beside the fire. Outside, clouds gathered again, promising another spring storm. Hannah tried to focus on her needlework, but her concentration kept slipping. Finally, she set aside her mending with an exasperated sigh. "They're fine," she told the empty room. "They're in town with proper shelter and people who can help them." But even as she spoke the words, Hannah found herself remembering the exhaustion in Hank's eyes, the protective way he'd held his daughter. Silver Peak was no place for a man alone with an infant. The town catered to miners and the businesses that served them: saloons, a general store, a few boarding houses known more for their rowdy guests than comfortable accommodations. There were families there, certainly, but they kept to themselves, wary of the transient population that flowed through with the fortunes of the mine. "It's not your concern," Hannah told herself firmly, rising to prepare for bed. She had spent 8 years cultivating independence and isolation. She wouldn't throw that away over one night of disrupted routine and misplaced concern for strangers. Yet as the rain began to fall once more, pattering against her roof and windows, Hannah found sleep elusive. Her thoughts kept returning to Lily's small face, to the gentle way Hank attended to his daughter, despite his imposing size and obvious exhaustion. 3 days passed, and Hannah settled back into her routine, though not without occasional, unwelcome thoughts of her brief visitors. On the morning of the 4th day, she hitched her wagon for her monthly trip into Silver Peak for supplies. It was pure coincidence, she told herself firmly, that she was making the journey a week earlier than usual. The road into town was rutted from the recent rains, but passable. Hannah guided her team with practiced ease, her thoughts stubbornly refusing to anticipate whether she might encounter Hank and Lily. Silver Peak had grown substantially with the mine's success, expanding from the handful of buildings she'd first known to a proper town with several streets branching off the main thoroughfare. The chances of crossing paths were slim. Hannah parked her wagon in front of McCready's general store, securing the horses before stepping down. As always, she felt a prickle of discomfort at the stares her arrival attracted. A woman alone was still something of an oddity, even in a frontier town like Silver Peak. Inside the store, Hannah handed her list to Mr. McCready, a balding man with spectacles who'd been running the establishment since before Hannah arrived in the area. "Mrs. Morgan," he greeted her with a nod, "earlier than usual this month." "Spring planting," Hannah replied shortly, discouraging further conversation. As McCready gathered her supplies, Hannah browsed the shelves, considering whether to indulge in the small luxury of store-bought coffee beans. Her attention was caught by a conversation between two women at the fabric counter. "Poor man doesn't know what he's doing," one was saying. "A baby that small needs a woman's care, not to be dragged around by a father who works all day. The widow Simmons is watching her while he's at the mine," the other woman replied, "but she says the child cries all night, keeps the whole boarding house awake." Hannah froze, her hand halfway to a bolt of calico. They could only be talking about Hank and Lily. "Where are they staying?" she asked before she could stop herself. The women turned, surprised by her interruption. Hannah rarely engaged in town gossip, or any conversation at all, for that matter. "The new miner with the baby?" the first woman asked, her curiosity evident. "They're at Simmons' boarding house, though word is she's about to turn them out if the baby doesn't quiet down." Hannah nodded her thanks and returned to the counter, where McCready had assembled her supplies. "Add a pound of coffee beans," she said, making a sudden decision. "And some sugar." McCready raised his eyebrows, but complied without comment. As Hannah paid for her purchases and arranged for them to be loaded into her wagon, she debated with herself. It would be foolish to seek out Hank and Lily. Whatever difficulties they were facing, they weren't her concern. Yet after her wagon was loaded, Hannah found herself walking not back toward the road home, but deeper into town, toward the row of boarding houses that lined the street nearest the mine entrance. She told herself she was merely curious, perhaps concerned about the child's health after her fever. Simmons's boarding house was a 3-story structure, once painted white, but now grayed with the constant dust from the nearby mine. Hannah hesitated at the front steps, second-guessing her impulse. But before she could retreat, the door opened and a harried-looking woman emerged, a wailing bundle in her arms. "I can't do it anymore, Mr. Jameson," the woman was saying to someone still inside. "I've got paying customers threatening to leave. You'll have to find other arrangements." Hank appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with exhaustion. He reached for Lily, who continued to cry even as he took her from the woman's arms. "I understand, Mrs. Simmons. I'll figure something out." Hannah stepped forward before she could reconsider. "Mr. Jameson." Both Hank and Mrs. Simmons turned at her voice. Surprise, then relief washed over Hank's features. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, "I didn't expect to see you in town." Mrs. Simmons looked between them with undisguised curiosity. "You know each other?" "We're acquainted," Hannah replied neutrally. To Hank, she said, "How is Lily faring?" Hank bounced his crying daughter gently. "Not well, as you can hear. She won't settle, barely sleeps." He lowered his voice. "And now it seems we're without lodging." Mrs. Simmons had the grace to look somewhat embarrassed. "It's not personal, Mr. Jameson, but I run a business, and a crying baby isn't good for business." Hannah studied the infant's red face, the way she arched her back in discomfort. "She might have colic," she observed. "My son had it. Chamomile tea sometimes helps, and warm compresses on the belly." As soon as the words left her mouth, Hannah realized her mistake. She never spoke of her son, not to anyone. She hadn't even told Hank she'd had a child during their brief stay. If Hank noticed the slip, he gave no sign, his attention fully on his daughter. "I'll try anything at this point. We're both at our wits' end." Mrs. Simmons cleared her throat. "As I was saying, Mr. Jameson, you'll need to find other arrangements by tonight." Hannah looked at the boarding house owner's unsympathetic face, then at Hank's exhausted one. A voice in the back of her mind, the voice of 8 years of careful isolation, screamed a warning. But watching Lily's distress and Hank's desperate attempts to soothe her, Hannah found herself speaking words she never thought would cross her lips. "You can stay with me." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her in surprise. Hank's, Mrs. Simmons, and even little Lily's, whose cries momentarily subsided as if shocked by the offer. "What?" Hank asked clearly, thinking he'd misheard. Hannah straightened her shoulders. "You and Lily can stay at my place until you find suitable arrangements in town," she added hastily. "There's the old bunkhouse my husband built for hired hands. It needs some work, but it's sound. You'd have your privacy." Mrs. Simmons's expression shifted from surprise to speculation, her eyes darting between Hannah and Hank. Hannah could practically see the gossip forming behind the woman's eyes. "That's very generous, Mrs. Morgan," Hank said slowly, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not generosity," Hannah replied, perhaps too sharply. "It's practicality. The child needs stability, and you need rest if you're to work effectively. I have the space." She hesitated, then added, "And I know something about caring for colicky infants." The admission hung in the air between them, an unintentional revelation of her past. Hank seemed to understand the significance, his expression softening. "If you're certain," he said at last, "just until I can make other arrangements." Hannah nodded, already wondering what madness had possessed her to make such an offer. "I have supplies to collect from McCready's. Meet me there when you're ready to depart." Without waiting for a response, Hannah turned and walked away, her heart pounding with the enormity of what she'd just done. After 8 years of carefully maintained solitude, she had just invited a stranger and his infant daughter to stay on her property indefinitely. "You've lost your mind, Hannah Morgan," she muttered to herself as she strode back toward the general store. Yet beneath the self-recrimination was something else, a flutter of something that felt uncomfortably like anticipation. An hour later, Hannah sat in her wagon outside McCready's, waiting as Hank loaded his few possessions alongside her supplies. He worked efficiently, securing each item with the care of a man used to life on the move. Lily, momentarily calm, watched from a sling across his chest. The ride back to Hannah's homestead passed mostly in silence, broken only by Lily's occasional fussing and Hank's murmured reassurances. Hannah kept her eyes on the road, acutely aware of the man sitting beside her on the wagon bench. His size, his warmth, the gentle rumble of his voice as he spoke to his daughter. "I appreciate this, Mrs. Morgan," Hank said, as Hannah's cabin came into view. "More than I can say." Hannah flicked the reins, urging the horses forward. "It's temporary," she reminded him, "and you'll be staying in the bunkhouse, not the cabin." "Of course," Hank agreed readily. "I wouldn't expect otherwise." The bunkhouse stood about 50 yards from the main cabin, a simple one-room structure with a small porch. Hannah hadn't entered it in years, using it primarily for storage. As she led Hank inside, she noted with some embarrassment the layer of dust covering everything and the musty smell of disuse. "Like I said, it needs work," she said, pushing open the gas-shuttered windows to let in fresh air. "But the roof doesn't leak, and the stove works." Hank set down his bags, looking around at the sparse accommodations. 2 simple bunks, a small table with chairs, a pot-belly stove in the corner. "It's more than adequate. Thank you." Hannah nodded stiffly. "I'll leave you to get settled. There's a pump behind the cabin for water." She turned to go, but Hank's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Morgan, Hannah, why are you doing this?" Hannah paused in the doorway, considering the question. Why indeed? She'd spent 8 years avoiding entanglements, connections, anything that might breach the walls she'd built around her grief. "I told you," she said finally. "It's practical. The child needs proper care." Hank shifted Lily in his arms. "There's more to it than that." Hannah met his gaze, struck again by the clarity of his blue eyes. "Perhaps," she conceded, "but that's all I'm willing to say on the matter." With that, she left him standing in the dusty bunkhouse, retreating to the familiar sanctuary of her cabin. Only when she was alone did she allow herself to acknowledge the truth of his observation. There was more to it, a pull toward this man and his child that defied the careful boundaries she'd maintained for so long. "It's temporary," she reminded herself firmly, "just until they find something suitable in town." But as Hannah moved through the familiar routine of her evening chores, she couldn't ignore the awareness of their presence nearby. The occasional glimpse of Hank through the bunkhouse window as he cleaned and arranged the space. The sound of Lily's cries carrying on the evening breeze. Her solitude, so carefully preserved for 8 years, had been irrevocably disrupted, and despite all her misgivings, Hannah couldn't quite convince herself that she regretted it. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect early spring day in the Colorado high country. Hannah rose with the sun, as was her habit, and was surprised to find Hank already at the chopping block, splitting wood with practiced efficiency. Lily, she noted, was secured in a makeshift carrier fashioned from a wooden crate lined with blankets, placed safely away from flying wood chips, but within her father's sight. Hannah paused in her doorway, watching the scene. There was something almost domestic about it. A man chopping wood while his child looked on, the smoke from her chimney curling into the morning air. For a moment, it reminded her so powerfully of her life before that she nearly retreated back into the cabin. Instead, she stepped fully outside. "You're up early," she called. Hank paused mid-swing. "Hope I didn't wake you. Lily was fussing at dawn, so we decided to be productive." "How did she sleep?" Hannah asked, approaching the crate to check on the infant. "Better, after I tried that chamomile tea you suggested." Hank set down the axe and wiped his brow. She still woke several times, but settled more easily. Hannah nodded, pleased despite herself. "Good. Are you heading to the mine today?" "Yes. My shift starts at noon." Hank hesitated. "I haven't found anyone willing to watch her while I work. Mrs. Simmons was the only one, and, well..." Hannah knew what he was asking without him having to say it. "I can watch her," she said, the words coming easier than she expected. "But only until you make permanent arrangements." Relief washed over Hank's features. "Thank you. I promise I'm looking for a more permanent solution." "See that you do." Hannah straightened, adopting a more businesslike tone. "Breakfast is cooking. You're welcome to join me before you head to town." Over a simple meal of biscuits and gravy, Hannah explained her daily routine to Hank and how Lily would fit into it. "I'll be working in the garden most of the day. She can be with me there. If she gets fussy, I have remedies that might help." Hank nodded gratefully. "She's usually good during the day. It's nights that are hardest." When it came time for Hank to leave for his shift, Hannah witnessed a moment of hesitation as he handed Lily over. It was the first time since her mother's death, Hannah realized, that Hank had entrusted his daughter to someone else's care for an extended period. "She'll be fine," Hannah assured him, taking the baby with more confidence than she felt. "I raised a child before. I remember how." The admission slipped out easily this time, less painful than she'd expected. Hank nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and something deeper. "I know she's in good hands," he said. With a final caress of his daughter's cheek, he mounted his horse and rode toward town. Left alone with Lily, Hannah experienced a moment of panic. What had she been thinking? She hadn't cared for an infant in over a decade. And the last time? None of that, she told herself firmly. The past is past. Settling Lily into the carrier Hank had fashioned, Hannah brought her to the garden, where spring planting awaited. Throughout the day, as Hannah worked the soil and planted the seeds that would feed her through the coming winter, she found herself talking to Lily, explaining what she was doing, naming the vegetables, even humming old lullabies she thought she'd forgotten. Lily proved to be an attentive audience, watching Hannah with curious eyes when awake and sleeping peacefully in the dappled shade when tired. Only once did she become truly fussy, her face reddening with discomfort. Hannah promptly prepared a warm compress, as she'd suggested to Hank, gently massaging Lily's tiny belly until the discomfort passed. "There now," Hannah murmured, cradling the now calm infant. "Not so difficult, are you?" As the day progressed, Hannah found herself slipping with surprising ease back into the rhythms of caring for a child. The weight of Lily in her arms, the soft sounds of her breathing, the way her tiny fingers curled reflexively around Hannah's, all of it awakened memories that were bittersweet, but no longer unbearable. By the time Hank returned at dusk, Hannah had completed her planting, fed and settled her livestock, prepared supper, and was sitting in her rocking chair with a sleeping Lily nestled against her chest. Hank entered the cabin with obvious apprehension, his face smudged with coal dust from the mine, his shoulders tense with worry. When he saw the peaceful tableau before him, the tension visibly drained from his body. "How was she?" he asked softly, removing his hat. Hannah smiled despite herself. "A perfect angel most of the time. We had one episode of colic, but the compress helped." Hank crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside the rocking chair to gaze at his sleeping daughter. The tenderness in his expression as he brushed a finger across Lily's cheek stirred something in Hannah that she thought had died with her family. "And how was the mine?" she asked to distract herself from the unwelcome emotion. "Hard work, but good pay," Hank replied, his eyes still on Lily. "The foreman was pleased with my experience. Says I might advance quickly if I proved myself." "That's good," Hannah said, suddenly aware of how close Hank was, of the faint SC scent of earth and sweat that clung to him. I made supper. You should eat before it gets cold." Hank straightened, seeming to suddenly register how close they were standing. "I should wash up first," he said. "Don't want to get coal dust all over your clean home." As he stepped outside to use the pump, Hannah found herself studying Lily's peaceful face, struck by how natural it felt to hold her. One day, she reminded herself, that was all it had taken to crack open the door she had kept so firmly closed on her maternal instincts. "Dangerous," she whispered to the sleeping infant. "You and your father are very dangerous to my peace of mind." When Hank returned, face and hands scrubbed clean, Hannah reluctantly transferred Lily into his arms. "She's been fed and changed. She should sleep a while longer." They ate together at Hannah's small table, the conversation flowing more easily than she would have expected. Hank told her about the mine, the men he'd met, the work he'd been assigned. Hannah found herself sharing details about her garden, the new techniques she was trying this year, her plans for expanding her chicken coop. It was the longest conversation she'd had with another adult in years, and she was surprised to find she enjoyed it. Hank was an attentive listener, asking thoughtful questions and offering intelligent observations. His presence filled her small cabin in a way that should have felt intrusive, but somehow didn't. When the evening wound down, Hank prepared to return to the bunkhouse with Lily. At the door, he paused. "Hannah," he said, using her name for the first time that day. "Thank you, not just for watching Lily, but for everything." Hannah nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with his gratitude. "Like I said, it's temporary." "Of course," Hank agreed, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Good night, then." "Good night," Hannah replied, watching him carry Lily across the yard to the bunkhouse, his broad back illuminated by the rising moon. As she closed the door and prepared for bed, Hannah tried to ignore the emptiness of her cabin, the silence that had once been comforting, but now felt oddly hollow. One day, she told herself, that was all it had taken to disrupt 8 years of carefully cultivated solitude. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as she drifted to sleep, she wondered what the next day would bring. Days stretched into a week, then 2. Against her own expectations, Hannah fell into a comfortable rhythm with Hank and Lily. Each morning, Hank completed whatever chores he could before heading to the mine, returning in the evening to share supper with Hannah before retiring to the bunkhouse with his daughter. During the day, Hannah found herself enjoying Lily's company as she worked around the homestead. The infant's presence added a dimension to her routine that Hannah hadn't realized she missed. Someone to talk to explain things to share the small victories and frustrations of daily life. "See these beans," Hannah would say, holding up a seedling for Lily's inspection from her shaded spot in the garden. "By summer, they'll be taller than your father." Lily would gurgle in response, her dark eyes tracking Hannah's movements with bright curiosity. Sometimes, when Hannah spoke of certain things, the best way to predict weather from cloud patterns, how to tell when a chicken was about to lay, she caught herself using the same words she'd once used with her son. The realization brought a momentary pang, but no longer the crushing grief it once had. The changes in Lily over those 2 weeks were remarkable. Her colic episodes became less frequent, and she began sleeping for longer stretches, much to Hank's relief. She smiled readily, especially when Hannah sang to her or told her stories while working. Changes in Hank were equally noticeable. The exhaustion that had lined his face when they first met gradually eased. He gained confidence at the mine, returning each evening with tales of his work and the respect he was earning. He took more initiative, around the homestead as well, repairing fences, reinforcing the chicken coop, and even building a proper cradle for Lily from salvaged wood around the property. "You didn't have to do that," Hannah said when he presented the cradle one evening, beautifully crafted with smooth edges and a gentle rocking motion. "I wanted to," Hank replied, watching as Hannah placed Lily in his creation. "You've done so much for us. It seemed a small way to repay you." The cradle was far from small. It represented hours of work after long days at the mine. Hannah ran her hand along the polished rail, touched by the gesture, in a way she didn't want to examine closely. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "You have skill with woodworking." "My father was a carpenter before he took up ranching," Hank explained. "He made sure I learned the basics." He hesitated, then added, "Your work is finer, though. I saw the chest in your bedroom. The one with the carved wildflowers. That's craftsmanship." Hannah was surprised he'd noticed. "My husband taught me," she said. "After he died, I kept at it. It helps to have something to focus on during the long winters." It was the most she'd revealed about her past since Hank and Lily had arrived, and the admission hung in the air. Hank seemed to sense the significance, his expression softening. "Loss shapes us," he said quietly. "Sometimes I think Lily is the only reason I kept moving after her mother died." Hannah nodded, understanding completely. Children give us purpose when nothing else can. The moment stretched between them, a shared recognition of similar grief. Then Lily cooed from her new cradle, breaking the tension. Hannah stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I should start supper," she said, moving toward the stove. Hank nodded, respecting her need for space. "I'll finish up with the horses." As the days passed, Hannah found herself watching Hank more often. The careful way he handled Lily, the strength in his hands as he worked, the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to her. She noticed other things too, the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, how his smile transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. These observations troubled her. She had long ago resigned herself to solitude, convinced that the pain of loss outweighed any joy companionship might bring. Yet here she was, finding herself drawn to this man and his child in ways that threatened the careful walls she'd built around her heart. One evening, as they sat on Hannah's porch, watching the sunset after settling Lily in her new cradle, Hank broke the comfortable silence. "Have you ever thought of remarrying, Hannah?" The question caught her off guard. "No," she answered reflexively. Then, more honestly, "At least not for many years." Hank nodded, eyes fixed on the mountains turned gold by the setting sun. "I didn't think I would either after Rachel died. It seemed disloyal somehow." Hannah understood the sentiment. Yes, as if moving forward means forgetting. Exactly. Hank turned to look at her, his expression serious. "But lately I've been wondering if that's true. If perhaps honoring their memory might mean finding joy again." The implication was unmistakable. Hannah felt a flutter of panic. This connection, attachment, the possibility of loss was precisely what she feared. She stood abruptly. "I should check on Lily," she said, though they both knew the baby was sleeping peacefully. Hank didn't stop her. But as Hannah retreated into the cabin, she felt his gaze follow her, patient, understanding, and carrying something else beneath it. Something that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. Later that night, after Hank returned to the bunkhouse, Hannah sat by her window, watching moonlight spill across the yard. 3 weeks had passed since the stormy night when a cowboy and his infant daughter appeared at her door. 3 weeks that had somehow begun unraveling 8 years of determined isolation. This isn't what you planned, she told herself. Remember why you chose this life. But as she finally retired to bed, she couldn't help wondering if it was time to consider a different path, one that included the man and child who had so unexpectedly entered her life. The following Sunday dawned bright and clear, a perfect late spring day in the Colorado mountains. Hank had no shift at the mine, and after completing the morning chores together, an unusual restlessness settled over them both. "It's too fine a day to stay cooped up," Hank observed as Hannah hung laundry on the line. Lily lay on a blanket nearby, kicking her legs in the dappled sunlight. "What do you say to a picnic?" Hannah paused, a damp sheet in her hands. "A picnic? There must be some nice spots nearby." Hank gestured toward the rolling hills surrounding the homestead. "A creek or meadow where we could spend a few hours." The suggestion was so unexpected, so ordinary, that Hannah nodded before she could overthink it. "There's a nice spot about a mile east where the creek widens. Good shade trees." "Perfect," Hank said, smiling in a way that made Hannah's stomach flip. "I'll saddle the horses if you'll pack some food." An hour later, they were riding side by side toward the creek, Lily nestled securely in a sling across Hank's broad chest. Hannah led the way, acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd done something purely for pleasure. Her trips to town were always for necessities. Her rare ventures beyond her property always had a purpose: hunting, gathering herbs, checking fences. The spot she chose was one of her favorites, a small clearing beside a bend in the creek, where cottonwoods offered shade and wildflowers scattered the grass in bright patches. As they dismounted and Hank spread a blanket, Hannah found herself suddenly shy, unsure of the etiquette for such an outing. "This is perfect," Hank said, settling Lily on the blanket and unpacking the simple lunch Hannah had prepared: bread, cheese, cold chicken, and early spring berries she'd gathered the day before. They ate in companionable silence, listening to the gurgle of the creek and the rustle of leaves overhead. Lily, content after feeding, dozed between them. "You know," Hank said eventually, "in the 3 weeks we've been here, you've never told me your story." Hannah tensed slightly. "There's not much to tell." "I think there is," Hank countered gently. "A woman living alone on a successful homestead for 8 years, that's not a common tale." Hannah was silent so long that Hank began to think she wouldn't answer. Then, eyes on the sleeping infant rather than him, she began. "My husband Nathan and I came out here from Pennsylvania in '64. The war was still on, and we wanted no part of it. Nathan had been injured at Antietam. Not badly, but enough to get discharged. We thought we could make a fresh start out west." She paused, running her fingers through the grass. "We did well at first. Built the cabin, started clearing fields. Our son James was born in '66. We were happy." The words caught in her throat. Hank stayed silent. In '67, influenza swept through this part of the territory. It came on so suddenly. One day, James had a slight cough. The next, he was burning with fever. Nathan caught it caring for him. I nursed them both for days, but she swallowed. I buried them on the same day, behind the cabin where the aspen grove starts. "I'm sorry, Hannah," Hank said softly. "It was a long time ago." Everyone told me to sell the homestead, move back east, or at least into town. She shook her head. But this place was all I had left of them. So I stayed, learned to do everything Nathan had done, built a life alone. And in 8 years, you never thought of leaving? Starting over somewhere else? Where would I go? Hannah asked simply. This is my home. Their home. Hank nodded. After Rachel died in childbirth, I couldn't stay in our cabin in Montana. Too many memories. So I took Lily and traveled south, taking work wherever I could. I told myself I was looking for a place to settle, but really, I think I was just running. And now? Hannah asked, meeting his eyes for the first time since she began. Now, Hank said, I'm not sure running is the answer. These past weeks, watching you've built something strong and true here, despite your loss. It's made me think about what I want for Lily, for myself. Hannah looked away, uncomfortable. We should head back soon. Clouds are building over the mountains. Hank accepted the change of subject graciously. But as they packed up and rode home, Hannah felt something had shifted between them. She had shared her story, opened a door she kept closed for 8 years, and Hank, with quiet strength and gentle understanding, had walked through it. The following week brought changes to their routine. Hank was promoted to shift supervisor at the mine, a position with better pay but longer hours. Hannah found herself caring for Lily for longer stretches, and to her surprise, she didn't mind. The infant had become a bright spot in her days, her development a source of genuine joy. She rolled over today, Hannah reported one evening as Hank returned dusty and tired, all by herself, from back to front. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Hank's face lit up at the news. Did she really? That's my girl. He scooped Lily from her cradle, exhaustion forgotten as he praised her. Hannah watched them, a familiar ache in her chest. Not pain, but the bittersweet recognition of what she'd lost and what perhaps she might find again. As May gave way to June, the homestead flourished under their combined efforts. Hannah's garden thrived. The repairs Hank made to the outbuildings gave the property renewed purpose. Even the bunkhouse transformed from dusty storage to proper lodgings, though Hank and Lily spent most waking hours in the main cabin. In town, people noticed. Hannah's monthly supply trips now included Hank and Lily, and the three together drew curious glances and whispered comments. Hannah pretended not to notice, but was acutely aware of the speculation. Mrs. Simmons asked me today if we'd set a date, Hank mentioned casually one evening on the porch. Hannah nearly choked. A date for what? Our wedding, Hank replied, amused. Apparently, the good people of Silver Peak have decided we're secretly engaged. That's ridiculous, Hannah sputtered. We're not. You're just staying here temporarily while you find proper accommodations in town. It's been over a month, Hank pointed out mildly, and I haven't exactly been looking for other accommodations. The admission hung between them. Hannah realized they hadn't spoken of him leaving in weeks. Their temporary arrangement had quietly become something that felt different. What did you tell Mrs. Simmons? She asked. That it wasn't her business, Hank said. But I also didn't correct her assumption. Hannah looked at him sharply. Why not? Hank held her gaze. Because I'm not sure I want to leave, Hannah. And I don't think you want us to, either. His directness stole her breath. It was true. The thought of the cabin without Lily's laughter or Hank's steady presence had become difficult to imagine. Somehow, Somewhere, they had become essentials in her life. Hannah began, but faltered. This is happening too fast. Hank reached across the space between them, covering her hand with his. Is it? Or has it been building since that first night you opened your door to us in the storm? Hannah couldn't answer. The warmth of his hand, the earnestness in his eyes. It was too much. She pulled her hand away and stood. I need time, Hank. I never planned for this. I know, Hank said softly. Neither did I, but here we are. Here they were indeed, Hannah thought as she retreated inside. A woman who chose solitude, a man running from grief, and a child who brought them together. It sounded like something from a dime novel, too neat, too perfect. Yet, as Hannah prepared for bed, she couldn't deny the rightness she felt when the three of them were together, the sense of completeness she hadn't felt in so long. Was she brave enough to reach for it? To risk her heart again after years of careful protection? The question haunted her as she drifted into uneasy sleep, dreaming of storms and sanctuary, of loss and unexpected second chances. The summer solstice arrived with a burst of activity around Silver Peak. The town planned a celebration, a dance in the new meeting hall, followed by a picnic the next day. Such events were rare in the mining community and generated excitement. Will you go? Hank asked as they worked in the garden, Lily napping nearby. To the dance, I mean. Hannah paused. I haven't attended a town social in years. Maybe it's time to change that, Hank suggested. He hesitated. I'd be honored to escort you, if you'd allow it. The formal phrasing made Hannah smile despite herself. And what about Lily? Mrs. Jenkins from the assay office offered to mind the children during the dance. Her daughters will help. Hannah raised an eyebrow. You've given this some thought. I have, Hank admitted. I think it would be good for you, for us, to participate in community life. Hannah returned to her weeding, considering. The idea was daunting, yet appealing. Music, an evening out, perhaps even dancing, especially with Hank. I'll think about it, she said. That evening, after Hank and Lily retired to the bunkhouse, Hannah opened the trunk at the foot of her bed for the first time in years. Beneath layers of carefully preserved memories, James's baby clothes, Nathan's pocket watch, letters from back east, lay her best dress, wrapped in muslin. She lifted it out, shook the folds free. Dark blue calico with white flowers, once her Sunday best. She held it against herself and moved to the small mirror. The dress would still fit, though it might need taking in. 8 years of hard labor had reshaped her body. Studying her reflection, Hannah barely recognized the woman looking back. At 32, she was still handsome, her brown hair streaked with silver at the temples, her face tanned and lined from the sun, but still youthful. Her eyes had changed most, once soft with happiness, then hardened by grief, now showing something new. Uncertainty, possibility, hope. You're being ridiculous, she told her reflection. It's just a dance. But as she folded the dress again, she knew it was more. Accepting Hank's invitation meant stepping back into a world she'd abandoned 8 years ago, acknowledging that perhaps her self-imposed exile had run its course. The next morning at breakfast, she announced her decision. I'll go to the dance, she said, setting biscuits on the table. If the offer still stands. Hank's smile lit his whole face. It does. I'll need to make some adjustments to my dress, she said. It's been a while since I've worn it. I'm sure you'll look beautiful, Hank said warmly. Hannah looked away, flustered. Yes, well, it settled then. The days leading up to the solstice dance held a new anticipation. Hannah spent evenings altering her dress, taking in the waist and refreshing the lace. She even dug through the trunk for the cameo brooch that had been a wedding gift from Nathan's mother. The night of the dance arrived warm and clear, the mountains bathed in golden twilight as Hannah prepared. She'd washed her hair that morning and now pinned it up with combs from her trunk. The dress fit well, the dark blue flattering against her sun-bronzed skin. The cameo at her throat felt like a bridge between her past and her future. When a knock sounded at the door, Hannah took a deep breath and opened it. Hank stood on the porch, Lily in his arms, both dressed in their best. Hank had trimmed his beard, slicked back his hair, and wore a clean white shirt with a string tie beneath a vest. The sight made Hannah's breath catch. "You look," Hank began, then shook his head. "Hannah, you're stunning." Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Jameson." The ride into town was filled with nervous energy. Lily, sensing the excitement, babbled happily, reaching for the shiny buttons on Hank's vest. Silver Peak was transformed for the celebration. Lanterns hung from posts, casting a warm glow. The meeting hall decorated with streamers and wildflowers. A small band setting up on a platform. As Hank helped Hannah down from the wagon, she felt a moment of panic at the thought of facing the whole town. But his steady presence, his hand at the small of her back, gave her courage. They delivered Lily to Mrs. Jenkins, who'd set up a nursery area for the youngest children. Then, with a reassuring smile, Hank led Hannah into the hall. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. Conversations paused, heads turned. Hannah felt the weight of curious stares. But before she could freeze, the band struck up a lively tune, and Hank leaned close. "Would you honor me with this dance, Mrs. Morgan?" His formality, paired with the twinkle in his eyes, made Hannah smile, despite her nerves. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Jameson. Though I should warn you, it's been years since I've danced." "Then we'll remember together," Hank replied, guiding her onto the floor. At first, Hannah moved stiffly, hyper-aware of watching eyes and her rusty steps. But as the music continued, and Hank guided her with steady confidence, she began to relax. By the third dance, she was laughing as Hank twirled her through an energetic reel, her earlier self-consciousness forgotten. When they paused for refreshments, Hannah was breathless, but happier than she'd been in years. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed dancing," she admitted, as Hank handed her punch. "You're a natural," he said. "I'm the one, struggling to keep up." The evening progressed in a blur of music, laughter, and conversations with townspeople she'd kept at a distance for years. She accepted compliments on her garden, discussed chicken breeds with a farmer, and even promised to contribute preserves to the harvest festival. Through it all, Hank remained at her side, his pride in her evident in every introduction and every shared smile. When he wasn't dancing with her, he conversed easily with miners and businessmen, respected for his position and integrity. As the evening drew to a close, the band shifted to slower tunes. Hank led Hannah onto the floor again, but this dance was different, closer, more intimate. His hand at her waist drew her nearer than propriety allowed, and Hannah found she didn't mind. "Thank you for coming tonight," Hank murmured. "Seeing you like this, happy, laughing, It's the most beautiful sight I've ever seen." Hannah looked up, struck by the sincerity in his expression. "I didn't think I could feel this way again," she admitted. "After everything, I thought that part of me was gone." "Nothing that fundamental ever truly leaves us," Hank replied. "It just waits for the right time, the right person, to bring it back." The music swelled, but Hannah barely heard it. She could focus only on Hank, his eyes, his question. She was ready to answer. When he leaned in, she rose to meet him, their lips touching in a gentle, profound kiss, an acknowledgement of shared grief, unexpected connection, and hope for a future they hadn't dared imagine. Around them, the dance continued, but for Hannah and Hank, the world narrowed to just the two of them, standing on the edge of something new. Later, as they collected a sleepy Lily and rode home under the stars, Hannah rested her head against Hank's shoulder. No words were needed. The shift in their relationship had been acknowledged and embraced. As Hank helped her down from the wagon, he paused, Lily sleeping in his other arm. "I know this is all happening faster than you expected," he said quietly. "If you need more time—" Hannah shook her head. "I've had 8 years of solitude, Hank. I don't need more time to know what I want." She reached up, touching his face, and drew him into another kiss, bolder, more certain. When they parted, Hank's smile glowed in the moonlight. "Stay in the cabin tonight," Hannah said softly. "Both of you. No more bunkhouse." It was an invitation that went beyond the practical, and they both knew it. "I would be honored," Hank replied. "Tonight, and for as many nights as you'll have us." As they entered the cabin together, Hannah felt the last of her reservations fade. The home she had kept alone for so long felt more complete with Hank and Lily within its walls, as if they had always been meant to fill the empty spaces grief left behind. The summer unfolded in a haze of happiness Hannah had never expected to feel again. Days were filled with shared work, tending the growing garden, caring for livestock, improving the homestead. Evenings brought quiet intimacy, shared meals, stories, Lily's bedtime rituals, and later, the private moments between Hannah and Hank that deepened their bond. In town, reactions to their relationship varied. Some, like Mrs. Simmons, viewed their beginning with suspicion. Others, seeing their happiness, were supportive. "When's the wedding?" became a frequent question, one Hannah and Hank discussed privately, but hadn't announced. "There's no rush," Hank said one evening as they watched Lily stack wooden blocks. "We know what we have. A ceremony won't change that." Hannah appreciated his patience, his willingness to let their bond evolve at a pace that respected her lingering fears. Though she had opened her home and heart to them, a part of her still feared formalizing it, worried that doing so might invite tragedy, as if happiness were something too fragile to claim openly. Yet as summer ripened toward autumn and the aspens turned gold, Hannah's fears softened. Watching Hank with Lily, the way he encouraged her first attempts at crawling, his endless patience when she fussed, the love shining in his eyes. Hannah couldn't imagine life without them. One crisp September morning, while gathering the last summer vegetables, Lily playing beside her, Hannah made a decision. That evening, after Lily slept and Hank relaxed by the fire, Hannah took a steadying breath. "I think we should get married before winter," she said, her hands busy with mending but her eyes on Hank. "If you still want to, that is." Hank set aside the bridle he'd been repairing. expression serious. "Hannah, nothing would make me happier. But are you certain? I don't want you to feel rushed." Hannah set her needle down, choosing her words. "For 8 years, I lived in the shadow of what I'd lost. I convinced myself solitude was safer than connection, that memories were enough." She met his gaze. "You and Lily showed me how wrong I was. I'm certain." The joy on Hank's face said everything. He knelt beside her chair, took her hands, and said solemnly, "Hannah Morgan, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife and Lily's mother?" Though unnecessary after her declaration, the formal proposal brought tears to Hannah's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "with all my heart, yes." They married the first Sunday in October, with the aspens blazing gold against the deep blue Colorado sky. The ceremony took place at their homestead, officiated by Reverend Tompkins. The guest list was small, but meaningful. Miners who had become Hank's friends, townspeople with whom Hannah had rebuilt connections, and neighbors who'd watched her solitary life with concern. Hannah wore her blue dress, freshly altered and adorned with new lace. Lily, now crawling and pulling herself up on furniture, wore a little dress Hannah had sewn from the same fabric used for new bedroom curtains, a symbol of the home they were creating. Hank stood proudly beneath the arbor he'd built and decorated with autumn flowers. As Hannah walked towards him, sun warming her shoulders and Hank's smile warming her heart, she felt the last shadows of grief recede. "We gather today," Reverend Tompkins began, "to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony, and to celebrate the family they have already begun to build." The words felt true. Their path had not been traditional, and the Reverend acknowledged as much. As they exchanged vows, Hannah felt a profound rightness, not replacing what she'd lost, but building something new that honored her past. "I, Hannah Morgan, take you, Hank Jameson, as my husband," she said, voice steady, despite emotion tightening her throat. "To love and cherish through all life's seasons, to partner with in building our home and raising our children, and to honor the journey that brought us together." When Hank repeated similar vows, tears glistened in his eyes. And when he spoke of "our daughter Lily and any children with whom we may be blessed," Hannah felt a surge of maternal love so strong it stole her breath. Their kiss was gentle yet profound, a promise, a commitment, a declaration that they had found in each other a second chance neither expected. The celebration that followed was joyful. Tables were set beneath the trees, food contributed by neighbors. Lily was passed from arm to arm, charming everyone with her newfound wave and infectious laugh. Late in the afternoon, Hannah stood apart for a moment, watching Hank talk with miners, Lily perched on his hip. The sight of them, her husband, her daughter, filled Hannah with a contentment she hadn't felt in nearly a decade. "He's a good man," a voice said. Hannah turned to find Mrs. Jenkins beside her. "He is," Hannah agreed. "And you deserve happiness," Mrs. Jenkins added. "We've all worried about you out here alone." Hannah blinked in surprise. "You have?" "Of course. A community looks after its own, even when they try to keep their distance." The older woman patted her arm. "I'm glad you found your way back to us." That evening, after guests departed, and Lily slept in her crib, in the newly cleared second bedroom, Hannah and Hank stood on the porch watching stars appear. "Happy?" Hank asked, drawing her close. "More than I thought possible," Hannah admitted. "I was so afraid, Hank, for so long. Afraid to care, to connect, to risk losing everything again. "I know," Hank said. "After Rachel died, leaving Montana was as much about running from grief as finding a new start." Hannah turned in his embrace, and Hank brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not running anymore," he said. "I found where I belong, with you, with our family." "Our family," Hannah repeated, savoring the phrase. "It feels right. The three of us." "It does," Hank agreed. "Though perhaps someday it might be four of us, or even five." The idea of more children, siblings for Lily, new life in a home once filled with loss, made Hannah's heart swell with both anticipation and anxiety. But looking at Hank's face, illuminated by the last light of their wedding day, she knew they would face whatever came together. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Someday." Hank's kiss held promise of partnership, passion, and the life they were building. As Hannah melted into his embrace, she sent a silent acknowledgement to the ghosts of her past. Nathan, James, and the woman she had been before grief reshaped her. They would always be part of her, but they no longer defined her future. That future belonged to the family she and Hank were creating. A family born from loss, sustained by love, hope, and the courage to begin again. Winter came early that year, the first heavy snow falling before Thanksgiving. But within the walls of the Morgan Jameson homestead, all was warmth and light. The cabin, once a shrine to Hannah's solitude, had been transformed by Hank and Lily, now toddling confidently between furniture, her vocabulary expanding daily. Hannah rediscovered joy in traditions she had abandoned, decorating with pine boughs for Christmas, baking treats, singing carols by the fire. Hank embraced these customs wholeheartedly, building Lily a small wooden rocking horse and gifting Hannah a delicately carved jewelry box that must have taken weeks of secret effort. As winter deepened, bringing long nights and star-filled skies, Hannah and Hank settled into the rhythms of married life. Hank continued as shift supervisor, his leadership well respected. Hannah maintained the homestead, cared for Lily, and still found time for the woodworking that had sustained her through years alone. Together, they planned improvements, spring planting, adding livestock, expanding the cabin with a larger kitchen or another bedroom. These shared discussions, filled with hope and practicality, became some of Hannah's favorite moments. In February, during a particularly fierce blizzard, Hannah shared news that reshaped their plans. "I think," she said carefully, watching Hank's face in the firelight, "we might need that extra bedroom sooner than later." Confusion flickered across Hank's features, then dawning comprehension. "Hannah, are you saying—" She nodded, joy and trepidation mingling. "If my calculations are correct, we'll welcome a new addition late summer." The book in Hank's hands fell forgotten as he knelt beside her, his large hands cradling her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered, wonder and delight woven into his voice. "Our baby." Hannah covered his hands with hers, the reality still sinking in. After losing James, she had never thought she would carry another child. Fear of loss had been too great, yet here she was, nurturing new life, filled with cautious hope. "Are you happy?" Hank asked gently. "I know this might bring back difficult memories." "I'm terrified," Hannah admitted, "and overjoyed, and grateful." She squeezed his hands. "Most of all, I'm grateful I don't have to do this alone." "Never alone," Hank promised, lifting her carefully into his arms. "Not anymore." As spring returned, melting snowdrifts and coaxing new growth from the earth. Hannah's body changed with the season. Her pregnancy progressed smoothly, though each milestone brought moments of remembrance for the child she had lost. Lily, now nearly 18 months old and constantly chattering, seemed to understand that something important was happening. She patted Hannah's growing belly, repeating "baby" with solemn concentration, as if practicing for her future as a big sister. The people of Silver Peak, who had welcomed Hannah's re-entry into community life, now showered her with advice and practical gifts. Hannah accepted the attention with more grace than she would have a year earlier, recognizing the kindness behind it. One warm June afternoon, as Hannah sat on the porch shelling peas with Lily helping beside her, a wagon approached on the road to their homestead. Hannah shaded her eyes and recognized Mrs. Jenkins and her daughter Emily. "Visitors," Hannah said, smoothing her apron over her prominent belly. "Shall we welcome them?" By the time the wagon reached the yard, Hank had emerged from the barn. Together they greeted their guests. "We hope we're not intruding," Mrs. Jenkins said as Hank helped her down. "But Emily and I have been working on something we wanted to deliver." Emily, a shy young woman, lifted a large basket from the wagon. "It's a tradition in Silver Peak," she explained, offering the basket to Hannah, "for new mothers." Inside was a handmade quilt sewn from dozens of fabric squares, arranged in interlocking stars. Each square, Emily explained, had been contributed by a different woman from town or nearby homesteads. "Everyone who could sew added a piece," Mrs. Jenkins said proudly. "Even those who barely know you wanted to participate. It's our way of saying the community stands with you." Hannah traced the careful stitching, recognizing fabrics from dresses she'd seen around town. The gesture from women she had kept at arm's length for years touched her deeply. "It's beautiful," she said, voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Mrs. Jenkins replied kindly. "Just know you're not alone, not anymore." The words echoed Hank's promise from the night she'd told him about the baby, and Hannah felt their truth settle deep within her. The walls she'd built around her grief had not just cracked, they had been dismantled, making room for a community she hadn't known she needed. As summer peaked, Hannah's time grew near. The garden flourished. Lily thrived. Hank divided his time between mine and home, taking on more of the heavy chores as Hannah's mobility decreased. In the cool pre-dawn hours of an August morning, Hannah woke to the unmistakable beginnings of labor. She lay still a moment, breathing through the first contraction, memories of James's birth washing over her. But where that memory once brought only pain, now it offered a strange comfort. She had done this before. She knew what to expect. "Hank," she said softly, touching his shoulder, "it's time." What followed passed in a blur. Hank sending a neighbor boy for the midwife, tending to Lily, supporting Hannah through each contraction. By mid-morning, the midwife arrived, calm and capable. "You're doing beautifully," she said after examining Hannah. "Not your first, is it?" "No," Hannah panted, sweat dampening her hair. "But it's been a long time." "Your body remembers," the midwife assured her. "Trust it, it knows what to do." Hours passed. Labor intensified. Hank remained by her side, anchoring her through each wave of pain. Outside, she could hear Lily's laughter as Mrs. Jenkins entertained her. "I can't lose this baby," Hannah whispered during a particularly brutal contraction, gripping Hank's hand. "I can't go through that again." "You won't," Hank promised. though they both knew he couldn't guarantee it. This child is strong, like its mother. The final stage came swiftly. With Hank supporting her and the midwife guiding, Hannah brought their child into the world with one final powerful push. "A boy!" the midwife announced, as lusty cries filled the room. "A fine, healthy boy." Hannah collapsed back against the pillows, exhaustion and exhilaration warring within her as the midwife placed the infant on her chest. Through tears she examined him, the shock of dark hair, the tiny fingers, the determined mouth. "He's beautiful," Hank whispered, voice cracking as he touched his son's head. "Hannah, he's perfect." "Samuel," Hannah said softly, the name they had chosen if the baby were a boy. Samuel Hank Jameson. Later, after Hannah had been cleaned up and settled, Hank brought Lily in to meet her brother. The toddler approached with unusual caution, her eyes wide as she peered at the bundle in Hannah's arms. "Baby," she said solemnly, pointing. "Yes, Lily," Hannah confirmed. "Your baby brother, Samuel. Can you say Samuel?" "Sam," Lily pronounced carefully, reaching to touch his tiny hand. "That's right," Hank said proudly. "You're a big sister now. You'll help us take care of Sam, won't you?" Lily nodded enthusiastically, though she likely didn't understand. What mattered was that she accepted him without jealousy, a blessing Hannah hadn't dared hope for. In the days that followed, Samuel proved easy, nursing well, sleeping reasonably, content to be held. His resemblance to Hank was striking, though Hannah thought she saw her mother's eyes in his soft features. Watching Hank with Samuel, the gentle way he held him, the songs he sang during night feedings, the pride in his eyes, deepened Hannah's love for her husband in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel asleep in Hannah's arms, while Lily played with wooden animals nearby, Hank spoke gently. "I've been thinking," he said, "about James and Nathan." Hannah tensed slightly, but nodded for him to continue. "We've never visited their graves together," he said. "I wondered if, maybe it's time, if you'd want to take Samuel and Lily there." It was a sensitive suggestion, acknowledging the place her first family still held in her heart. Though the whirlwind of the last year had changed much, Hannah had maintained private rituals of visiting the graves on significant dates, alone. "I'd like that," she said after a moment. "They're part of who I am, part of what made me the woman you and the children love. It feels right to introduce you all properly." The next day, as afternoon light slanted through the aspens behind the cabin, Hannah led her family to the small fenced plot where two simple wooden markers stood. She had tended the space for years, planting wildflowers, keeping the grass trimmed. Lily, sensing the solemnity, clung to Hank's hand. Samuel slept against Hannah's chest, unaware of the moment's weight. "Nathan and James Morgan," Hank read softly, "beloved husband and son." "Nathan was a good man," Hannah said, her voice steady despite emotion tightening her throat. "Kind, hard-working, patient. He taught me so much about building, about wood. He'd have liked you, Hank. You share the same quiet strength." She knelt carefully and touched the smaller marker. James was just 3 when the influenza took him. So bright, so curious. He'd have been 11 now. She glanced at Lily, who watched with solemn eyes. "He would have been a wonderful big brother." Hank knelt beside her, one arm around her shoulders. "Thank you for sharing them with us." They stayed there for a time, Hannah telling a few stories, answering Lily's simple questions with gentle honesty. It wasn't the grief-stricken visit of years past, but something new, a recognition of loss that didn't overshadow the joy of the present. As they walked back to the cabin, Lily skipping ahead and Samuel beginning to stir, Hank squeezed Hannah's hand. "You're the bravest person I know," he said quietly. Hannah looked at him, surprised. "Me? How do you figure that?" "To endure such loss," Hank said. "To live alone with it for so many years and still open your heart again. That takes incredible courage." Hannah considered this. "I don't know if it was courage," she said finally. "More like necessity. That night, you and Lily appeared in the storm. You weren't the only ones seeking shelter. I think I needed saving just as much as you." Hank smiled, eyes bright. "Then I'm grateful we found each other, Hannah Morgan Jameson. More grateful than I can say." As they reached the cabin, now filled with the sounds of children and the steady hum of life, Hannah felt a completeness that had eluded her for so long. The past remained, honored, but no longer overshadowing her future. She had once believed isolation protected her from pain, but it had also walled her off from joy. Now, standing on the homestead she had tended alone for 8 years, surrounded by the family she never expected to have again, she sent a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had brought a cowboy and his motherless baby to her door that stormy night. Some might call it chance, others divine intervention. Hannah preferred to think of it as a second chance, one she had nearly turned away, but found the courage to embrace. And in that embrace, she had found not just survival, but a life more abundant than she ever dared hope for.